Hi there, what lurks beneath. My name is Gale, and I'm here to tell you about some sightings that I've had all throughout the swamps of Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and even parts of Florida. I've had the luxury of living throughout the entire country in multiple states. To name a few: New Mexico, Oregon, Colorado, Texas, New York, and of course Louisiana. Now, they say Louisiana is actually a hotbed for paranormal and witchcraft, but it's also home to terrors of the swamp, as I like to call them, because they're things that once you see, you wouldn't believe them if nobody told you about them. Most people won't believe me, but I've seen some crazy stuff out in the swamps. Things that you think can only appear in your nightmares. But no, you would be so wrong to assume otherwise. Creatures that can kill you, worse than moccasins or alligators. One time, I was actually out in the bayous with thick smog rolling in, and I seen this, I kid you not. What I didn't know at the time was I thought it was a massive alligator, but it was actually an alligator humanoid. But as this thing rose out of the water and grabbed this 5-foot alligator and tore it into pieces, I was able to get a much better sight. It looked to be part man, part alligator, so I kind of call it the alligator man. But this thing was a hulking demon. It had to have been at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick muscles, rippling, scales everywhere, and a massive hulking body. I'm talking like a football player on steroids, maybe 4 to 5 feet at the shoulder width, completely hulking and massive like I said. It's terrified me to death, and that's only one instance that I've seen. Luckily, this thing was too busy eating an alligator to really pay attention to me rowing by. I've seen Dogman out here in the swamps too. That's why there's just certain spots that I refuse to go to, because they are very intelligent predatory animals. I've been followed by what I assume was a pack of them. They were staying just beyond the reach of the trees, keeping an eye on me, and at times when I'd look just right, I could see the faint glow of their eyes staring at me, making sure I wasn't wandering too far off from whatever trap they were setting up ahead. See, the swamps are just not meant for people. They aren't meant for human survival, period. And I believe that even some of the native tribes had a hard time surviving deep in the swamp. In fact, depending on who you talk to, they'll give you some pretty hair-raising details about bog creatures and other things that live below the swamp waters. Everything from summoning and witchcraft to flesh and blood creatures. There's all sorts of terrors out here, especially at nighttime. Where do you think fiction pulls a lot of their ideas from? I've had the misfortune of seeing many of these swamp creatures myself to understand their existence, as well as to know where Hollywood gets their inspiration from. In fact, many of my close friends that I've acquired over time are also avid adventurers of the swamp, and have their own encounters with what they refer to as the skunk ape, something many might not know of unless they live down here in this giant swamp area. I haven't seen one yet myself, but I've seen enough of the other horrors in these parts that it's more than enough for me. I don't really believe in Bigfoot, but I would imagine that they too live down here. I don't live in the swamps anymore, but I've spent enough time to know what I'm talking about. Again, there's just certain parts of the area that you kind of just want to stay away from. And believe it or not, too many people will go out venturing too deep into the swamp. Number 1, it's just not safe. And number 2, you tend to run into things that let you know that you're too far out. Like the crocodilian humanoids, for example. I've only ever seen one, but it was enough for me. Somehow, I came across your videos before messaging you, and I happened to click on one of the reptilian videos. It was about an older gentleman who, just like me, wandered out into the thick bayous and encountered these same humanoid beings. That's how I know I'm not crazy. When I'm hearing written and verbal accounts of other people reciting the same sightings that I've had, the same details of the same creatures, it just means they're out there, and we are not supposed to be in their territory. I try to take the native approach on the whole thing. If you respect them, hopefully they'll just leave you alone. But be aware, they are the alpha predators of the swamp, along with Dogman and whatever else lives out there. It's not just the entire Louisiana area either. Some of the sightings I've had span all the way into southern Alabama and the surrounding areas. It can be incredibly dangerous, even more so at nightfall. A very close friend of mine, who's actually far more of an adventurer than I am, encountered what he believed to be a den of some sort of large predatory animal, or animals. He was deep and far out in the swamps, near Texarkana actually. For those who don't know, that's right around the border of Texas and Arkansas in a small town called Texarkana. I could be wrong on my geography, so if you know that I'm wrong, please correct me. But anyway, I want to say he was either north or east of this location. He did not give me exact coordinates, but he found this dugout, as he describes it, and that led into a very large tunnel, wide enough and tall enough for him to slightly crouch and go into. He said that it led probably about 30 feet down at a sharp slope and dropped off into a very large open room. The entire room was completely dug out, is how he described it, with a ceiling taller than his head, probably around 10 to 12 feet in height, if he had to guess. That was probably about 20 to 30 feet in length. Again, these are just guesstimates. He only had a tiny flashlight, so he couldn't see well, but he said the odor was unlike anything that he's ever smelled before. It was an overpowering smell of death, blood, and rot, like that room had just been filled full of carcasses left to rot in the swamp. However, upon shining his light and looking around a little bit, he couldn't find any trace or source of the smell, but he did see that at the other end of this dugout room, the tunnel led deeper into this den, which he didn't continue to go down. He said he got a really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach, like he needed to leave now, or that something was going to be approaching him very soon. Safe to say he got out of there, and luckily, in one piece. But it just goes to show you, there are things in the swamp that we should stay away from. What's kind of eerie is when he was explaining to me the details of this den, and how it was dug out, and the way it was dug out. He said it almost appeared to be dug out with a tool-like object, that it wasn't just hands, or it wasn't just like an animal had dug it out with their claws. I don't know. The whole thing is very disturbing to hear. And he said, why would there be a person that dug out a chamber that large? And even though I've seen my fair share of stuff out in the swamp, this is a man who is far hardier than I am. In fact, when he was a little younger, he nearly had his right leg taken off by an alligator by surprise. So he doesn't scare easily. And when he tells me he was terrified and could feel in his gut that something was wrong and he needed to leave, that's really saying something. I take his opinion and word very seriously. He's never let me down and doesn't make up stories like this. He's not that kind of guy. When I prompted him with more questions about the den, he said that again, he has no idea how many chambers or pathways this thing went down into. But the pathway he could see that looked like it led down into another chamber, he said he felt like there might be something down there. But he did not hear anything, any movement, any shuffling, nothing. Only the ghastly strong odor of death and blood, and again, with no source of the smell. After he got out of there, he said it was even more humid and dank in there than you can imagine it being, since the swamp is already pretty bad. This friend is also one of the same friends who has had multiple run-ins with a skunk ape too. And trying to think about it, trying to think logically, of course, I can't attribute that den to a cougar, beavers, or bears, or any other natural animal that occurs in the swamp. So I really have no idea what would build a chamber that large, or a tunnel, mind you, with not even their bare hands or claws, but some sort of tool object like what he described. This same friend knows well about my own encounters with what I call the alligator man, the same creature that I saw pick up a 5 to 6 feet alligator, tear it in half, and eat its guts right in front of me, rising up out of the water in the thick fog. And to think, had I just rowed a little bit over, I would have landed right on top of this thing, and it would have capsized my tiny little boat in the swamp. Scary. I felt sending you this email was very important, since you already seem to have a wealth of knowledge and information that you're sharing and putting out there anyway. I thought I would send you mine and add to the ever-growing pile, so that way people who have these sightings and experiences don't bottle themselves up and feel crazy and feel like a lunatic having to keep all this information inside their head. Because I'm telling you now, you gotta let it out. Other people deserve to know that this kind of stuff is out there, and they need to protect themselves and understand the true dangers of being out in thick wooded areas. I'll keep you up to date and let you know if I encounter anything else, or if any of my friends have any more horrifying stories they can share. Many of them do, so I'll go ahead and reach out to them in the coming weeks and see if I can't muster up anything from them worthy enough to share with you. Anyway, this is Gale signing out. I'll keep you up to date and let you know if anything else happens. Have a good one, and thank you again for all the information and hard work you put out. I've been meaning to reach out to you for some time now. My name is Dylan. I have a very in-depth background in cryptozoology. I'm currently 38, work from home, and I spend a lot of my free time researching and understanding cryptids. But I also spend a lot of my time hiking in the woods, exploring, and doing my own solo trips out in the wilderness of the United States. Anyway, I listen to your content already, so you're speaking my language since you know so much about cryptids just like I do. And I want you to know, before I go any further, in case you decide to read this, that I want you and everybody else to know this is not a case of mistaken identity. I have done enough research on Bigfoot, Dogman, and most other cryptids people don't even know about to know that what I saw, there's just no mistaking. I don't know if this thing has a name per se, but it was very defined, and that I've never seen anything else that looks like this. This sighting also took place in broad daylight, where there was no shadow, nothing obstructing it from view, and I only saw it from about 30 feet away, so I got a good look at it for more than just a few seconds. And being a cryptozoology enthusiast, it doesn't take long to start getting involved in the community, getting stories, sightings, and encounters from fellow friends. Basically, I've heard through the grapevine that there is a large population of not only Bigfoot, but buffalo wolves living out in these areas. Now, when I set out to hike and do my solo adventures, my intent is to never encounter or run into a cryptid. In fact, even though I'm really enthusiastic about the whole thing, that's the last thing I want to see, because I have that innate human primal fear in me that seeing something that I was told isn't supposed to exist just terrifies me. Let me go ahead and get to that. So, as you know from what I told you, I definitely frequent the woods of the United States, doing my own solo camping trips, exploring and whatnot. I'm a bit of an outdoors junkie as it is, which is why my love of cryptozoology matches up so well with my lifestyle. I do lots of frequent camping, and prefer to be in the outdoors more than I do inside. Anyway, this June, I was spending a couple weeks at the time exploring the outback areas of Montana, hiking around and sightseeing as much as I could. But this is the area where I had a sighting that I can only chalk up to what I thought was never possible. Now, I don't like using this term, because it really sounds like something you'd pull from a Dungeons & Dragons game. But, unfortunately, it does and is the only thing that accurately describes the physique in what I saw. A werebear. Now, before I go any further, let me stress that I do not believe this was a person that is transformed into a bear. I think that's very silly and nonsensical. I do believe that this was another cryptid among the many that I was lucky enough to witness. Although terrifying, I believe that this creature or cryptid shared the same physical attributes that you would see in the fantasy setting that a werebear has. As far as the setting goes, I had come across a river. I couldn't tell you exactly what river it was, but if I looked on a map and spent time, I could probably write you back and tell you exactly what river I was at. Anyway, I was walking up against the riverbank on the west side when I heard a loud shuffling on the opposite bank. Out from behind some rocks, stood up this massive bear. At least at first I thought it was a bear, and I realized this thing was standing on two legs like a bear, but the body looked entirely wrong. This thing was towering in height, and I know exactly what a bear looks like. I've seen them in the wild on numerous occasions, and again, this had a completely wrong body. I know bear do stand up on their hind legs. I'm well aware of that. But like I just said, and I cannot stress this enough, the body looked entirely differently than just a brown bear. Although what confused my mind, because it's only used to this realm of reality, was that the head was that of a brown bear. Kind of grizzly bear, I guess you'd call it. But the body was frightening, because it resembled that of a human being. And even the fur and hair on its body was very short compared to that of a brown bear. You can simply Google any bear, and you can see that the hair on their body is rather long and thick. But this, it was short and shaved down almost. Like it looked wrong. Even the hair and fur on its body was just not normal. When it stood up on two legs, it watched me, and it had an expression on its face that looked far more intense than any normal animal I've ever looked at. It's almost like I can see intelligence in its face, like it was studying me, observing me. This thing had a chest, torso, arms, and legs just like a man did, to a T. And also, the physique on this thing, it was ripped. Absolutely ripped. I'm talking rippling muscles underneath its short fur. And this thing looked like it had been lifting weights, day in and day out. It was also easily 9 feet tall, if not taller. I had to look up at it, into its eyes, to see it. That's why when I say this thing was towering above, I wasn't lying. Its face just read one simple expression: turn back. That's the best way I could sum up the look on its face. I was completely horrified at the moment, and also stunned at what I was seeing. However, because I had experience in survival classes and being out in the wilderness, I knew that you should never run from any sort of predator. So, I was able to maintain my composure and locked eyes with this creature and backed away very slowly until I was able to safely get out of the area. I've spent ample time all over the internet, Reddit for one, and other various sites, even going as far as contacting various people in the cryptozoology realm, and nothing. I have not talked to anybody who has seen or talked to any eyewitnesses that have seen a creature like this before. I don't know if you have, or if anyone else has listening to this, if you are reading this, but please, I would love for somebody to reach out to me. I want to know that I'm not the only one who has seen this. Even though I do have a love for cryptozoology, and it's not that I'm not having a hard time believing what I saw, I just can't be the only one to see this cryptid. Little did I know, that day, upon that river, I was going to encounter whatever this creature was. I mean, looking back, it really was a perfect area to seclude and never be hidden. Montana is pretty much a dead zone anyway. There's a whole lot of state and not a whole lot of people. If I was some sort of cryptid and I wanted to remain hidden, that's a good place to go. I feel like it's also important for me to state that even though I do have a love and obsession with cryptozoology and creatures in general, I have never once had a personal encounter with anything, even through all the backwoods hiking and exploring I've done. Not Bigfoot, not Dogman, nothing. So this is kind of a first for me, especially when I saw what I did, and I realized in that moment that this was neither a Bigfoot nor a Dogman, but something else entirely. Some sort of monster from the woods. And is it possible that had I stuck around, this thing would have taken me and ended my life? Well, I think it's possible, but that's why I wasn't wanting to stick around to find out. That's why I got out of there ASAP. As I mentioned to you earlier, I got a chance to get involved in the community, and even though at the time I didn't have any stories to share or swap, I got shared a bunch of encounters and sightings of not only Dogman, but Bigfoot. And these are the same individuals that once I had my sighting, I got to share my experiences with them, but to no avail. They had never heard of such a creature before, and once again, I am left wondering with no answers and no conclusions or resolutions. Truly, part of me firmly believes that I was the first person to see such a creature, but maybe not. I just have yet to find the right person to share their encounter with me. Hopefully, if your audience hears this, one of them will have had an encounter with the same creature. And again, I don't know if these creatures are exclusive to the Montana area. I just know that's where I had my sighting. For all I know, they could be all throughout Canada, and all of those thousands of acres of wilderness, uncharted and untouched by mankind. In conclusion of this email, I guess it should be no surprise to us that there are creatures out there that we have yet to see, the same as anyone discovering a cryptid for the first time. Have a wonderful day. I used to be a trucker way back in the day, and I've had all sorts of weird encounters and experiences, especially at truck stops. Those are not places you want to be late at night. But anyway, what I'm here to tell you about is something that I simply cannot explain, and there's no writing it off as something I dreamt or made up or had a vision of. This was a real flesh and blood creature. Let me explain. I was currently en route, and actually around the Point Pleasant area in Virginia, when I felt a heavy thud on the back of my cargo trailer. I decided to pull over since it felt like there was some added weight. After pulling over, I got out of my truck, and as soon as I got out and looked up at the top of the trailer, I was horrified by what I saw. Standing there on top of my cargo trailer was what I would describe to you, or what I know now as the Mothman. The first thing I saw were these two giant red glowing orbs. I nearly fell back onto my butt when I saw this. Then I saw the shape surrounding it, and just how large it was. In fact, I probably saw the wings first, before I did the rest of the body. It was getting dusk out, so it was pretty dark, and there wasn't a whole lot of light. So that's why I saw the eyes first, more than the body. But as soon as I saw this thing, it didn't take me more than 5 seconds before I saw all I wanted to, and I ran back in my truck, and I floored it out of there. I guess this thing must have took off, because as I'm pulling out into the road, not only did I do it recklessly and dangerously, not even flipping on my blinker, this thing must have flew off. But when I got out to look at it, it looked right at me. Now, at the time, I had no idea there was such a thing called the Mothman, and if you had told me about it then, I would have laughed at you, telling you that you're making up fake horror stories. Well, I was quickly proved wrong. After telling some of my friends about it, they told me that that area, Point Pleasant, is actually a hotbed for Mothman sightings. And you guessed it, I just happened to be a lucky individual to have my own very sighting of this supposed thing. The thing is, I don't consider myself lucky one bit. It was terrifying. It was almost a traumatic experience. Maybe not going that far, but I have no desire to run into this thing again, nor do I want to see it. After spending some time online and reading some encounters and sightings, there's actually a plethora of sightings of this same creature floating all around the internet. And well, I haven't taken the time to write mine down and submit it to all these websites. I thought I could start by sending in mine to yours, and hopefully, if I'm lucky, you'll read it, because maybe somebody else who has had their own encounter with something entirely different, or maybe the same creature, will hear this and understand that they are not crazy or alone. You gotta understand that when you see something like this, that it is so far out of the realm of normal that you begin to suspect you're losing it, that you're going crazy, and that you're not right in the head. I thought that for quite some time afterwards, until I was finally brave enough, or maybe the feeling bothered me enough that I had to tell somebody about what happened. Anyway, I'm not going to drag this on forever. You don't need to tell me twice the Mothman is out there, and I'm going to do everything I can to avoid ever going back there. Luckily, I don't have that same job anymore, so I have no reason to go back there. Count me lucky, I guess. Back in 1972, my grandfather recounts to me that at the time, he was working as a car salesman and even was working on starting his own car business. That was until my grandfather's business fell into total financial ruin and my grandmother passed away shortly after. But something happened that he can't quite explain, that he believes was a demon, an omen that visited to him and possibly projected evil onto his life. At the time, my grandmother and grandfather lived far on the outskirts in Chicago. They actually lived in a much more rural area. I believe it was north, but it might be east. I could be wrong. Either way, one night my grandfather was driving home, and he said that he was stopped in the middle of the road by this demon with 2 wings and large glowing red eyes. Keep in mind that at the time, he had never heard of the Mothman or heard of such a thing. Since it was only 1972, media outlets didn't really have a great way of going global yet or across the US. If you didn't have the newspaper, well, you didn't really know anything unless it was word of mouth. My grandfather swears this is true, that this evil being flew down to the middle of the road and spoke telepathically to my grandfather. My grandfather actually never fully told me what this thing told him telepathically, but from what happened afterwards, he said it touched his life in the worst way. 3 months after this encounter, his wife, my grandmother, came down with stage 4 cancer and passed away just a few months later. During that time, his business also seemed to go sour, having to file complete bankruptcy and leading to financial ruin. My grandfather turned to alcoholism for 12 years before finally joining AA and turning his life around. Today, my grandfather is alive, healthy, old as can be, and he eventually remarried. But he still can't refute that is one of the scariest things that has ever happened to him, and he believes that it is a supernatural omen that came to destroy his life, or so he believes. Personally, I'm not really sure what to think about it, although it is rather convincing, because my grandfather is not a storyteller. It's just weird how this thing appeared out of nowhere and projected its own negativity onto his life. And to this day, my grandfather firmly believes that whatever this thing was, which he now knows as a Mothman, or was the Mothman, is the one that caused his wife to die and his business to nosedive into financial ruin. The only thing I can really make out of my grandfather's story is that I do know that some people believe the Mothman is actually a bad omen and only appears when a catastrophe is about to happen. It would make sense, since its first appearance was right before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, only about 6 or 7 years prior to my grandfather's encounter. And then, shortly after appearing to my grandfather, his wife dying and his business going sour. How else would you describe that? What could it have possibly been? Is it possible that the Mothman is actually a demon? I used to live in Point Pleasant about 9 years ago, for about 1.5 years, because I worked a job down there, in which case I ended up moving because I got married. I'll spare you an incredibly long and boring backstory and just cut right to the chase. During my time there, even though I was only there 1.5 years, I quickly made a lot of friends and grew to be a small part of the community, knowing and getting to talk a lot of people. You wouldn't believe the number of sightings that I had heard firsthand. It was enough to make a believer out of me, some of whom were very credible witnesses, like previous sheriff deputies or first responders, and they each had their own harrowing stories. Sadly, I come to you with no encounters of my own, but I can tell you from all the eyewitness stories that I had heard, it's pretty terrifying what's going on down there. Apparently, this cryptid, I guess you call it, is running rampant. Sometimes people seeing it chasing them and attacking their car. Other times, people will see it flying around in the sky. Another man who had seen it jumping from tree to tree on his way on a lone road. When I first moved down there, I had actually never heard of the local legend myself, until I quickly befriended many people in the community, and that's when it became more and more out. I was even warned about certain places around town you shouldn't go after dark. Yeah, it got that crazy, but I didn't really pay any attention. I was kind of a loner anyway, as far as going around town. I kept to myself for the most part. I didn't really explore a whole lot. I kind of just stayed home, went to a couple friends' houses here and there, was a small part of the community for some time, but I didn't really go all over the town, if that makes sense. Like I said though, the most credible and real witnesses to me were the previous employees of the sheriff's department and first responders. Their accounts were harrowing and terrifying to listen to, many of them having their very own first-hand accounts themselves, and even the deputies, or previous deputies. Man, their stories were more than enough to send chills down my spine. If you haven't really heard of the Mothman, or haven't gotten a chance to explore the Mothman, I encourage you to start Googling and looking up sightings and encounters. I promise it won't disappoint you. After being down there and being enriched in that culture and hearing all the sightings and encounters, it just proved to me right then and there that maybe monsters really do exist. Hello, what lurks beneath. I'm a lifeguard at Harriet Beach in Miami, Florida. Or I was. I am writing into you to discuss and inform you of a recent incident just a few years ago on one of the beach resorts that has completely ravaged the tourism industry and led to a total lack of visitors in this very small area. Now, unless you're from there, you probably didn't really hear much of it, but this happened very quickly and was quickly cleaned up. I had been a lifeguard there for a while, about 10 years, since I was 18. I loved my job, the ocean, the people, even the beach bum life. It was my jam. But every day, I was beginning to feel this beach and resort had become something of a horror flick. Strange things had been happening. Very strange, disturbing things. At the time, and I still think there is, was a full-scale FBI investigation into the circular events occurring. Myself and the rest of the staff there were huge subjects in this investigation and were constantly being questioned. If you are reading this, well, you need to dismiss your notion of Florida as a haven of relaxation, enjoyment, and leisure, and instead, imagine a place where you feel unsafe, disturbed, and clouded in a feeling of impending terror. This is worse than Jaws. I don't know how much it's been cleaned up and taken care of since the COVID issue, but this is how it was when I was there. It was January that the first incident happened. I was catching a few waves on my surfboard, as we do when it's quiet. This was like 6 a.m., and so there wasn't many on the beach, except for a few joggers. I had my swimming shorts on and my seafoam green surfboard. It was tied to my ankle using a long leather leash like many surfers do. The currents were a little wild, and I remember feeling a little unsettled that the waves seemed to be stirring from all different directions and seemed a little erratic. They were usually totally calm and serene at this time in the morning. I saw a huge wave coming, and I couldn't wait to ride it. This was my life. Feeling free, alive, and at one with the ocean. It was an epic wave, and as I shot up on my surfboard, my glance extended right to my Pinewood Beach hut, where I would look out at the sunset with my own binoculars. As I rode that wave, feeling the electric adrenaline sent jolts of excitement up my spine and right to my head. My eyes shot down to my feet as the hazy sight of something like blood seemed to be seeping from my own ankle. Uh-oh. I gently stopped my surfboard and sat on it, putting my feet up to get a closer look. My ankle had been badly wounded, and blood was coursing out in a steady stream, modifying the azure blue with great bursts of explosive red. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but you get the idea. It was the strangest thing, as I had zero sensation of pain and no knowledge of having been bitten by anything. Shark attacks were common, but I knew how to read the signs. and my surfboard had a fin at the bottom to avert any shark attacks from occurring. Still though, I scanned the waters and saw nothing. At that moment, I turned around at the sight of something large and green swimming about 15 feet away from me. As the water was pure from this side, I noticed it had scales, large spikes, and what looked like teeth on its back. Was this a crocodile? I didn't think we had saltwater crocodiles down here. It was utterly bizarre. This creature turned around in a circle and protruded its face above the water, so it was not facing me. That's when my stomach sank, witnessing a large creature with a face of that of a dinosaur from times gone. Large eyes the size of small footballs, green, thick, scaly skin, and a green horn which was jagged and extending about 1 foot above its forehead. I had never seen such a creature before, and I knew instantly it was responsible for the wound on my foot. I managed to swim gently back to the shore and observe the creature as I stood there in the sand. My wound still coursing speckles of blood on the sand. So, I limped back to my hut, and after bandaging my foot, tried to use my binoculars to observe if the creature was still there, and if there was any more nearby. I immediately informed my manager, who decided to close that part of the beach for the day. He thought it was just some kind of fish, and that maybe I had just exaggerated the sighting, which is not uncommon when you're being pumped full of adrenaline and fear. But I knew what I saw. So, I took 2 weeks off on medical grounds. Even though my foot healed and I felt better, my nerves were completely wrecked. No one believed me or took me seriously. Not even my girlfriend, friends, or close family. They all believed it was too early in the morning and I was tired. But listen, I know what I saw. It was something monstrous. Some creature that I've never seen before, and I'm not sure if anybody else has. When I returned, the beach was running again as normal, and it was busier than ever. As I sat there in my hut, I looked from left to right, and it was extraordinary hearing and seeing such joy when just 2 weeks before, it had been a scene of terror. I always felt super comfortable working in the sea, having always been an avid swimmer. But as I looked out into the ocean, I felt sick and couldn't imagine anything worse than having to go back into it. Thankfully, there were no incidents in which I needed to rescue anybody. I began to see the creature everywhere. If anyone was swimming with a green t-shirt, my eyes would play tricks and I would shoot up, expecting to see some mayhem and carnage unfold before my eyes. A jolt of fear would trickle down my body, and I would break out in a cold sweat, even though it was ridiculously hot outside. I knew this wasn't a healthy way to live, and so I decided to seek help from my doctor. I started anti-anxiety medication and told the doctor about what I saw. Like everyone else, he put the vision down to stress and asked me if I used any recreational drugs at the time. I was really pissed off. As I sat home during one of my off days, I was surviving off crap food, toast and Twinkies. I couldn't even make love to my girlfriend, and I'm a 28-year-old guy with a beautiful girl. Whatever creature this was, it had unsettled me in a way that I never encountered. Just total anxiety. I even tried listening to some calm music, even some ASMR, but every time I closed my eyes, the large glassy eyes of the beast, cold and monstrous, would send a jolt of panic down my spine, and I would subconsciously flap my arms as if trying to swim away from the horror. I even had a secret desire for the creature to reappear and wound somebody else, so I would know that I had not gone crazy, at least not entirely. As I sat there in my lonely apartment, my phone rang, and it was my manager. He told me I needed to come in, and that I wouldn't want to miss this, and that he believed me. I remember sighing deeply, knowing that when I arrived, there was likely going to be another attack, but I didn't press him for any more details. I told him I would be there as quick as I could. So I took my bike, and I remember I pedaled maniacally. My legs were so numb and felt like jelly when I arrived because I pushed so hard. I didn't even bother to fasten my bike or secure it. I remember I just left it and ran to the office, where I was likely to meet my manager and be informed of whatever had happened. I remember that as I arrived at the office, our reception lady had pointed me to the very edge of the beach, close to the waves, where there was a large crowd that had gathered around what looked like a washed-up animal. It was green and long, and I instantly knew what it was. The beach was empty. It had obviously been evacuated, and there were cops circling around the area with clipboards, taking photographs. It was a surreal sight, like a crime scene right there, like I was living on the real-life set of CSI Miami. No children laughing, no ice cream, just the taste of fear in my mouth as I bit my lips, nearly causing it to bleed with trepidation. My manager had gestured to me to walk down, and I held onto my stomach, hoping I would not churn out the contents of my breakfast. My manager had informed me afterwards that the police had arrived as a beast, a reptilian-like sea creature, had its stomach severed. It was now dead, and it was found to have at least 5 to 6 human remains in its stomach. The remains were obviously detached and fragmented, but there was a forensic team on site who were confident that it was more than just one body. There was also a marine biologist present, taking more photographs and using his portable computer. I remember him squinting over the screen, and he simply didn't know what it was, and that he had never encountered such a thing. I'd asked my colleagues even, but the species was unknown from what I heard. One of the officers had informed me that this would be an ongoing investigation, and that some kind of plan needed to be conjured to stop people from using this section of beach. If word got out that a creature like this was commonly swimming in the water, there would be panic. Thankfully, no real word got out that I'm aware of, so I didn't have to worry about it going viral. And surprisingly, there really hasn't been any images of it that I can find on Google or Pinterest or anything. But of course, to me, the beast was real, and I was attacked by it. Luckily, it should be buried in the past, buried where it can't get to anybody, and nobody has to know it exists. As I write this, I can only thank the universe for protecting me. To have escaped with such a mild wound was amazingly lucky. This creature had obviously been intent on killing me and consuming me. It was a terrible end for anybody. I thought of those poor souls who had met such a tragic end. Had they enjoyed surfing like me? Were they adults, practically children, or were these recent killings of the time? It's not uncommon for surfers and swimmers to go missing or to drown and their bodies to not be recovered. I mean, usually bodies are recovered, but missing persons does happen, even on the ocean. To think that my job, which at the time I had relished and enjoyed so much, was now a scene of horror and brutality. Every day, it felt like a nightmare afterwards. That section of beach had been closed all year, and thankfully, once COVID came and hit, it made it easier. But really, it's because we fear another attack. Until the forensics have more information, which I never received, and why would I? I was not an important part of any investigation, really. There was also a team of academics around the world who are aware of beasts like this and creatures that exist. Anyway, we need to keep a lookout for more reptilian creatures like this in the ocean, waiting to emerge to consume anyone or anything. Who knows what led it out here to the coast of this beach? Perhaps its food chain was disrupted, or maybe it changed its sights on what it was wanting to eat. Hello. I'm sure you get sent a lot of stories detailing all sorts of horrible things happening to people. But one common theme that I've heard amongst some of your stories, not all of them, but just a handful, is this whole concept of Indian burial grounds. I've seen some comments on your channel that people dismiss the whole idea as being this stupid creepypasta cliche, but I'm here to tell you right now that they are adamantly very real. I cannot express this enough. Let me explain. Where I live on a bunch of land. And in fact, because of the land I live on, there's an old, well, what used to be Indian burial ground far out. And because I live on kind of like a slope that almost leads into a small valley, I have a perfect view of seeing where this monument used to be. Now, I know it's kind of hard to understand, but there's really not that much there now. The only thing that really remains is these large stone pillars that are very crude in design, and probably about 18 feet if I'm guessing. I'm not joking, and what I see upon them is exactly what I'm writing to you about. Sometimes, in the evening time, I'll see these large gargoyle-like figures perched on top. They are perfectly still like statues, but the issue being is that they are not always there. Sometimes they are there, and sometimes they are not. I've gone over to that area, hiking and exploring, and it's very uncomfortable to say the least. The entire place, not just the old burial ground, but even the land around it, has a very weird energy to it. It's a feeling. It's a very powerful feeling. It's kind of like you're walking into a field with a bunch of magnets. There's a lot of static and electricity. It's very hard for me to describe accurately. It's a place you would just have to go by yourself so you can get an idea of what it was. It's a place you would just have to go to by yourself just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. When I bought this land many years back, I was told that these old stone pillars are the remnants of what used to be a burial ground, and that it probably was a good idea if I stayed away from it. At the time, I just assumed it was a bunch of hogwash, but then again, I can't refute the feelings that I get when I walk around it. When I'm on my back porch, I have a perfect view because, as I said, the land slopes down into almost a tiny valley, and it sits right down there. If I had to say, I'd say it's probably between 300 to 500 yards away from my back porch. There are trees in between, but it's enough that I can see the stone pillars and the tops of them. Again, I want to get back to the real reason that I'm writing to you, but I have to set up the backstory to know that this place is eerie, and I have yet to walk around this place at nighttime. The one time that I nearly did, it was evening time, and it was years ago when I was exploring the area. I kept having this awful feeling, like I was being watched, like somebody was directly behind me, like they were going to reach out for me and grab me, but nothing ever happened. I like to say that I have eyes like an owl, where I feel like I can turn my head a total 180 degrees and keep a good eye around me at all times. But even then, with that extra sixth sense that I like to say I have, I still felt like I was in danger. So now, I try and stay far away from that area. The weird thing here is that I'm seeing these large gargoyle figures perched on top of these stone pillars. There are 4 stone pillars in total, and it's usually I only ever see these 4 gargoyle figures perched on each one, or I don't at all. It's never that I only see 1 or 2, or even 3. It's either all 4 or not, and they come and go. I'm not trying to give you or feed you a fiction story. When I go out there on my porch sometimes, and they're there, it's like I'm looking at statues. They're perfectly still, and I don't think they're living beings, but I don't know why they disappear and reappear. But here's where it gets creepier. Sometimes at night, I'll hear this screaming, this loud screeching screaming. It's almost like if you were to listen to a real-life dragon, or an eagle amplified by 10, and then put through some sort of distorted filter. And sometimes at night, I'll see dark shapes moving around. It's really creepy out here. Trust me when I say that I'd be the first person to laugh at you and tell you witchcraft, LOL, big deal. But I don't know. Now that I've been living in it, my mind is kind of changed. I know natives in general probably did some crazy freaky stuff to their burial grounds. I don't know for the sake of protection or what. Or maybe it's just that their magic died with them, and beings of different realms have come to protect it. I don't know. This is all just loose speculation. But whatever it is, I cannot deny the things and the horrors that are living around that burial ground. I understand it sounds cheesy, but again, I'm here to adamantly tell you that these things are very real. In fact, I invite anybody to go exploring in any burial ground and for them to tell me that they're not sensing anything weird or seeing dark shapes or things that shouldn't be there out of the corner of their eyes. I almost sometimes feel like I'm in danger, but luckily, from where I live and even where my back porch is, even though I have a perfect view of the entire establishment, I guess you could call it, I still sometimes feel like I might be vulnerable. Although I don't really feel anything come up to my house, so it's nothing like that. So I'm either having a very schizophrenic, lucid hallucination of these figures that look just like gargoyles, or potentially, there might be something much more evil at work here. This isn't my story, but actually one of my older cousins. He has a really crazy wild survival story of when he was serving and training in the military back in 1982. At the time, he and a few other individuals had been hand-selected for a survival training where they were to be put out in different areas of the Ozark Mountains and had to survive for 7 days with just minimal, basic supplies. Well, that's not the scary part. What is that he describes to me that he was attacked by what he says a large, half-man, half-bat creature that nearly picked him up off the ground and almost flew away with him. But he was able to break free, and what he said cut this thing's foot off with a large Bowie knife that he had. He obviously survived, and only fell about 20 feet, is what he said. He never told anybody of this encounter, at least anybody in the military, because nobody would believe him. And then years later, as he began living life, he started to hear things more like Bigfoot encounters and stuff like that happening out in the Ozarks, and how it just seems to be a general hot spot for paranormal and weird things to happen. You see, at the time, he knew nothing of Bigfoot or anything out of that realm of normal reality, so this was quite spooky to hear. And besides, my cousin is very straight to the point and doesn't have time for BS. It is completely out of character for him to make up a story like this. And when he tells me this story, he's as serious as a heart attack. You can see the expression in his eyes as he's describing what exactly this thing looked like. He just tells me that it was a half-man, half-bat. There's no other way to describe it. And he said this thing was larger than him. He said it came out from the trees, or so he thought. And because he was in an undisclosed location in the mountains, and he was by himself, there were no other witnesses around to disprove or prove what he had to say. He said, though, during those 7 days, besides that whole account, he hardly if ever saw any other animals, and actually at the time went pretty hungry because he had a hard time foraging for food and even finding much meat to eat on. So that was really his excitement for the entire trip. Since him telling me this, I've tried to do some of my own research, but I couldn't really find much, other than your traditional alien stuff and Bigfoot stuff along the entire Ozark area. Now, I don't know if I really necessarily disbelieve him, because, like I told you, he's a very serious individual and doesn't have time to make up stories, and he doesn't really have anything to gain from it either. He's not looking for notoriety or fame of any kind. In fact, he even asked that I keep his identity anonymous, just so nothing can be traced back to him, and fear that he gets ridiculed, or worse, especially in today's cancel culture. He has a reputation and a lot riding on it, so he couldn't bear to have his story known publicly, unless it was shrouded in anonymity. That's the only condition he gave me to be able to share this story with you. Had this happened to another individual who wasn't near as tough or hardcore as my cousin, they might not have lived, or survive to tell the tale. Anyway, that's my cousin's story. I hope you enjoy it. Do with it what you will. I found something the other day that I couldn't quite explain. I don't know if it was some kind of hybrid fish or what, but it scared me. I was out of my family's timeshare for 2 weeks last summer. My husband worked a lot of hours during the year, so he decided to get one of these timeshares and try it out. It was a very nice place, but something was wrong with it. Well, nothing was wrong with the house itself, but there was something wrong with the lake that was next to it. My kids wanted to go swimming in it, but I didn't. The lake had an unnatural green hue to it. I knew that if the kids showered off after getting out of the lake, they would be fine. I was definitely not getting in it though. I had just dyed my hair and was not about to let it turn to a moldy green color. I have 3 kids, one that is 13, one that is 9, and one that's only 3, and I didn't want to have her in the lake with her delicate skin. Something so large could be bad for her, especially if there weren't any baby stairs like we had in our pool back home. After we had gotten settled in the house and put away our things, I figured it would be okay to let the kids run out to the lake and play. I wanted them back in time for dinner and told them that, but I was unaware of what was going to happen that night. I put a little water from a bucket and filled Jamie's kiddie pool. It was only up to her waist, so she would be okay in there by herself. The water wasn't clear, but she would be okay for a little while. I told Julian to keep an eye on them while I went inside to start cooking dinner. I could see them from the kitchen window by the sink, so I could keep an eye on them if I needed to. After 20 minutes, I went outside to check on Jamie and was going to bring her, but she was crying about not wanting to get out, so I left her there while I went back to finish making dinner. After I had finished, I went outside and yelled for the kids to come inside. They got out of the water, and one of them was crying. She called for me, and I ran to her. I saw that she had these orange things all over her. They were the size of ladybugs, and they were orange. I tried pulling them on her, and with much strength and effort, was able to pull one off. It was orange on top, but it had legs, or teeth in her. I couldn't tell what it was, but when I pulled it off of her, it was more in her than just on her. It had seemed to stick itself inside of her skin, and just like a leech, was drinking her blood. I saw that they were on my others too. I picked up my littlest one from the pool, frantically checked her for any of those things. One was on her, but it didn't get past her swimsuit. I brushed it off of her and stepped on it. I took them inside with me and told my husband to help. He was yelling and wondering what happened. I got them carefully cleaned out with a knife, but he insisted that we go to urgent care. Those things left red marks all over their bodies, and it didn't seem like they took too much blood, but I still thought we should hurry. I looked down at all the things I took off the kids, and they had shrunk, like how grapes turn into raisins. I thought that we should take a few to show to the doctors, just so they could identify what they were, but I couldn't. When I tried picking them up, they just broke into little pieces. On the way to urgent care, my oldest started passing out. I almost worry if those things took too much blood. We got out, and my husband ran into the building with her in his arms, asking the front desk if there was anything they could do. I brought Jamie in my arms as I walked with Julian inside. Thankfully, the doctor saw them immediately. I told the doctor what had happened, and he said my oldest would be okay. All she needed was water. He said that those things were probably leeches. I tried describing to him that they weren't, that they were something else. Through all my persisting, he just told me that I needed to stop making up stories so he could get to his other patients. All he did was give me a prescription to get an ointment that would help the kids with the marks that were on their skin. It took a while, but the ointment eventually made their skin heal. But it left scars. I told my husband that we shouldn't be part of the timeshare anymore, and that we should leave so the kids couldn't go to the lake. I don't know what those things were, but they definitely were not leeches. Be careful of any new lakes you visit, because I never heard of these things before, but they like to be in water that's very foggy and green, just like that lake was. A very unnatural green. I should have trusted my gut instinct to begin with. I just felt like something was off to begin. Last year, I went vacationing out to Lake Michigan. I never liked vacationing with my family. I had one of those families that always wanted to do everything together. I never really fit into that structure of a family. I'm just a social outcast, both in the world and in my family. So any time I had alone to myself were the only times I felt like I could actually breathe. So, when we went to Michigan, I thought it was going to be the same thing. And in a sense it was, but I never thought it would turn out the way it did. I turned 14 the week after the vacation, and all I wanted to do was get some room to breathe. And the first time in my life, I had finally gotten that. When we went, my dad had gotten me my room in the hotel we were staying at. It was right next door to my parents', but it was the first time I felt like I actually had my own space. I could watch whatever TV I wanted to. I could have time to read my book that I had been trying to get time to read for months. It was something so small, but to have my own space, my own privacy, it was different. In the room, they had a few flyers for things to do to the nearby lake area. I flipped through some of them, and one caught my eye was an underwater adventure. It was similar to something like an aquatic park. The next morning, I told my dad if we can go to the place that I had seen in the flyers, and he said I can go by myself and that I was old enough. The place that they were going to wasn't far, so he agreed. They dropped me off at the lakeside aquatic area. I looked around, seeing the normal things that a place like that would have. They had booths for little kid games and other things, and I walked to the room where they had, and I was amazed by it. It was a large area with a big window facing into a side of the lake that they had divided just for the park. It was an amazing sight. We watched as somebody from above, the gigantic area dumped large amounts of some kind of fish feed in the water. What I thought was interesting, though, was that there was a fish swimming toward the bottom of the lake that was not interested in the feeding party at the top. It was a black fish, and it was swimming slowly. I couldn't tell if it had eaten already or not, but I got close to the glass and saw that it wasn't a fish at all. It looked as if it was some kind of decoy fish. It had sunk towards the bottom, and something was creeping up on it. Some kind of creature caught it and began biting into it. It looked like some kind of man, but he was biting into it. I was so confused about what was going on. It saw that I was still watching it, and swam to the corner where I was. It wasn't a man at all. It looked like some sort of aquatic humanoid. I don't know if what I was looking at was real or not, but it looked like it was staring right back at me. It had almost a human face, but it was as if it was alien because the way it looked at me. It had the shape of a human, but it kind of looked like an amphibious kind of creature. Its eyes were completely black. I don't know if somebody was messing with me, so I left the room to talk to somebody that worked there. I asked them about the fish man in the viewing room, and they said they didn't know what I was talking about. I looked for somebody else to find, but nobody was around, so I went back to this viewing room. Keep in mind, this is a really small room, and I was the only one in there at the time. I looked around for it again, and it was swimming behind some fish. It grabbed it with its webbed hand and took a bite out of it. I could see that it had extremely sharp teeth, because it had torn through that fish in no time. I thought that it was amazing. I guess someone else had seen the creature that I was talking about too, and one of the feeders above the viewing room was looking for it. They had a long pole in the water searching for it. It had an underwater camera on it looking in the water. The fish man saw and swam off. He swam towards the other side of the divided area and squeezed through the hole in the net where the small fish went in and out of. To this day, I don't know what it is I saw, or if anybody else had seen anything like it, but it seemed like it had been in that area for a long time. It could still be out there, and nobody would know. If it knew to hide from the camera, then it must have been there before. It must have been going in and out of the park. I had told my parents about it when they picked me up, and they laughed at me, making up silly things from all the books that I had read. They didn't believe me, but I know somebody had to. I know somebody, at least one person who had seen what I had, could just believe me. It couldn't have just been me. When I was 14, I went to a summer camp for boys. The summer camp was based in the very south of England, near Cornwall, and it was specifically for teenage boys between 12 and 17. That was over 20 years ago, and I am now writing this from my home study, where I spend my hours working as an architect. The summer camp was, as you can imagine, very lively and boisterous. In total, I think there must have been around 800 youths attending, and we were all allocated into cabins based on our age range. It was amazing, and a lot of fun, and very good for socializing, especially for a withdrawn teenager like myself. I made some lifelong friends at that camp, and I would go back in a heartbeat. But there was one disturbing incident that happened during the summer, an experience that still haunts me and unsettles me to this day. I believe that I encountered an unknown creature, possibly some type of cryptid. I'm not too familiar on the whole topic of cryptozoology, so maybe you could shed some light for me. I know it sounds crazy, and believe me, writing this makes me feel nervous, as I feel I could be referred to by some kind of mental health intervention. I have always felt I've been pretty sound at mind, and I've never had any problems with hallucinations. But what I saw during the summer of 1999 was something that I'll never forget. I understand that sounds very cliché, but it's the truth. I was in a cabin with 3 other kids, and we spent the evening playing strip poker. The idea was that the loser would end up naked and would have to jump into the lake, close to the camp. None of the camp leaders knew we were playing, and we used an old torch to create some light. But anytime we heard footsteps, we all raced back to bed and pretended to be asleep. On this occasion, I was losing, and losing hard. I was already down to my boxers and socks, and the other guy still had on his pajamas. A few more losses, and I would be naked, and the entire laughing stock of the camp. I was dreading jumping into the lake, which would be no doubt absolutely freezing and Baltic. I also wondered what kind of creatures were even in the lake, and I imagined leeches and crabs and all sorts of other slimy things. I shuddered, both from the thought and the draft coming into the window. The final round was dealt, and I only had 2 5s and no aces. I lost and took off all my last garments before walking to the lake. Some of the other cabins were watching from their windows, but I didn't think that they would pass much attention. I walked off the pier a little and braced myself for the ensuing icy immersion that I was about to undertake. As I stood there with smirks from the other cabin mates, I noticed something in the water, something moving, creating little tiny waves and ripples. I assumed it must have been a slight wind. I turned around and gave the boys a little wave before jumping in. As I came up, I was struggling for breath as the water was freezing and seemed to engulf my entire chest. Every inch of me was freezing and screaming in agony. I opened up my eyes, and I also noticed that the other guys had taken my clothes and ran back to the cabin, laughing. I cursed them as I tried to swim back to the edge and pull myself back up. As I tried to pull myself out, I felt something grab my foot from behind. My head jolted in fear as I turned back and was horrified at what I was seeing. A large creature which looked crocodilian, but with a human reptile face, had its arms outstretched, grabbing me, pulling me into the water. The face was distorted, with scales, and slimy and flaky. I was not only repulsed, but horrified. Its eyes were two without any iris, and a complete icy blue, which reflected off the dark water. They were almost illuminating a light, and piercing, and were steadily fixed on my face. The creature made no noise, but continued to pull me in with its arms. I started crying and screaming, hoping that some of the other boys would still be watching. I began to wonder if this was some kind of sick joke by the other guys, but it seemed too gruesome, too real. I knew this thing was not a prank, but something terrible, diabolical, something otherworldly, horrendous. I continued crying and realized I was actually being pulled underneath the water. I felt myself losing my grip on the edge of the embankment, and I tried to grab some nettles. I managed to grab hold of them and felt the stings filling my hand. The creature grunted and groaned as it sensed my resistance. I tried to flap my other legs and kick, which I did with all my intensity and strength that I could possibly muster. After a few seconds of this attempt at a backlash, I finally broke free and bolted to climb out of the lake. I managed, looking down at my feet, and could see a good gash and blood seeping now into the white concrete. I looked back at the creature and could only see its eyes, which were now watching me from underwater. It seemed to be sinking back to the bottom. Its icy blue eyes grew faint and finally disappeared underneath the murk. I just shuddered and cried on the spot, not having known if I just relived a nightmare or what. I went straight to the camp leader's cabin and got my wound bandaged. I told him something grabbed me in the water and bit me. He wasn't sure what to believe, but asked me if perhaps I hit a rock as I jumped in. Listen, I know this sounds like it might be out of a movie, but I know what I saw is real. It has haunted me to this very day, and it's one of the reasons why I don't go swimming anymore. None of the other boys believed me when I got back either, and it really bugged me that they didn't even come looking for me after I had been gone for an hour. I'm writing about this experience in hopes you could possibly enlighten me and check if there have been anything similar in that London area. I have begun mental health counseling as recently because this creature has begun frequenting my dreams and nightmares. I wake up in cold sweats. Again, I have not been in any outdoor pool, lake, or beach in over 20 years, and I have to make up excuses, saying I'm just allergic to chlorine or even salt water. But really, it's because I feel this creature will want to finish what it failed to do 20 years ago. When I was just a little girl, every year on my birthday, my dad would take me to the local fun fair for a day out. This started when I was around 3 and continued right up until I was about 12. But on the occasion of my 6th birthday, I had a very disturbing experience. I'm 38 now and a waitress based out of Dallas, Texas. Or I used to be. Thanks to COVID, I'm now unemployed. Anyway, it's hard for me to write about this experience, so I'm getting my daughter to help me. I can still remember exactly what I wore on my 6th birthday. Little pink shorts, frilly socks up to my knees, and a red shirt with kittens on it. I felt like a princess, and my dad always had a way of making me feel like one on my birthday. The reason he spoiled me so much was because, well, I was an only child, and he worked a lot in real estate at the time. He was away from home a lot, but always made sure he had the day off for my birthday. The fun fair, as I like to call it, was always a huge spectacle, and it was always a great buzz of activity, especially during my birthday month, July. My 6th birthday was going to be the biggest day out ever, and my dad promised that my mom made us pack sandwiches before we headed off in his Range Rover. My dad had his 2 cars, but always made sure we used his Range Rover on my birthday. In later years, it was a Mercedes, but on my 6th birthday, it was still the same old Range Rover. The day was fun and filled with exciting rides and amusements. My dad seemed to enjoy them too, and he made sure to take lots of pictures. We even bumped into a guy from his work, and he had his daughter with him too. So myself and this other little girl, who I can't recall her name, but we went on a few rides together. The whole day was bliss, and I remember realizing I was so lucky to have a dad who enjoyed spending time with me. Some of these thoughts are hindsight, as it is hard to remember my exact emotions at 6, but I'm doing my best to create a sense of the scene and my emotions to this day. Dad and I stopped at a diner on our way home for a burger. He left me in the car, as he said he was in a rush. He seemed to be gone for ages, and I had not much to look out for, except for the vast expanse of desert and highway, which seemed to at the time extend for an eternity. So, I decided just to focus on the mechanic in front of me, who was pumping air into some tires. This man was probably in his mid-40s, with darker hair, and a sturdier frame. I could tell he knew what he was doing, and he even spotted me in the car and gave me a little wave. As I sat there, he disappeared into the garage, and my eyes focused on the drain pipes underneath the van he was working on. This is where I remember feeling a sense of terror as I watched something emerge from the pipes. Something slimy, with scales and fins. A creature that squeezed through the cracks in the drain pipe and moved around, leaving a trail of red slime, which resembled blood. Its teeth, too, had seemed to have some hair, which looked like spikes or hay as I studied it. It then went underneath the car, and I remember feeling sheer terror as I hoped my dad would come out and rescue me. I can only imagine that this creature was the terrors my family told me about under the bed, or at night. I closed my eyes and hoped that the creature would go away or disappear. But then I felt a tapping under my seat. It was faint at first, but grew louder. Then a grunting started, a guttural, horrible croak that sent shivers up my spine. Then I heard my name being called in a horrible, diabolical voice. It called twice, and that's when I spotted my father coming back to the car. The grunt stopped, and my dad got in, and was surprised to find me in tears. Naturally, he didn't believe what I had seen, and just kissed my forehead and told me it had been a long day. But 32 years later, I know what I saw. I believe that this creature was some kind of demon, and that's why I'm reaching out to you after spotting your channel, especially to see if there have been any similar sightings around the area. The whole experience for me as a kid was terrifying, and it affected me in many ways that I didn't understand. Now, I am highly protective of my daughters and don't want to give them going anywhere where they can encounter danger. I have a fear of water and cannot walk over a drain without feeling a sense of fear and panic. I hope you can help me get over this, and possibly get to the bottom of this. Oh, and before I go, I'm not sure if this has anything to really add to my story, but it's an interesting piece of information that I would later find out. I guess that entire area is a hotbed for satanic and occult ritual activity. Again, I don't know if that really adds to my story or gives it any other support or evidence, but it's just something interesting that's added on. I didn't learn this, of course, until later in life, once I befriended somebody very close who lived in that area for a long time and had other weird sightings and feelings. Nothing, of course, like what I saw, but seeing shadows moving out in the darkness, hearing noises, and feeling watched. I don't quite know how to say this, so I'm just going to come out and say it. I saw something the other day in the swamp that just confused the utter dickens out of me. There are two reasons that I like to go to the swamps. One, because I like to row down it and enjoy nature as it is supposed to be. Two, is because I am part of a neighborhood watch. I'm not sure what to call it, but I basically go out and look for animals that are in danger and try to keep some animals away from poachers if I can. On one of my trips out, I noticed something lying in the way off the side of the river that looked like it may have been injured. It was laying on its side, and it was partially on the bank and partially in the water. I thought it might have been killed by something, or it was injured from something. I rowed off to the side of it and got out of my boat. I grabbed my snare pole out of the back and used the handle end to nudge the animal to see if it might have been resting. But it didn't move. Now that I was closer, it looked like it was a young crocodile, maybe only 5 months old. Well, the weird thing is, down here in America, we don't have crocodiles. We have alligators. So this looked very weird to me. I got my snare around where I thought its head would be, and I pulled it out of the water so it could breathe. When I saw that it wasn't an alligator or a crocodile, I don't know if I can describe it quite right, but it looked like a dog. Like a crocodile dog. I know that sounds weird, but that's what it looked like. It had the ears of the dog, the eyes of a dog, and a snout that quite resembled more of a crocodilian-looking thing. Except it had the trademark teeth of a crocodile. It was hideous looking. I also noticed that it had huge claws, and it had a mixture of fur and scales. What the hell? I thought. Was this some sort of science experiment gone wrong? Its body was green, but again, it looked and kind of resembled a dog. A very thick-skinned kind of animal. It was very hideous. Its mouth was hanging open too, like if it was panting. I took the snare off it and climbed back into the boat. I grabbed a beef jerky stick out of my backpack and opened it. I stayed in the boat, but I threw it towards the thing to see if the smell of meat would wake it up. I saw its nose twitching from the smell. It moved its head sideways to eat it. Whatever it was still very weak and small and frail, but I didn't know why. I grabbed my water and got back out of the boat. I slowly poured the water near it so it could drink. Normally, I think I should be terrified by whatever this thing was, but it was injured and in a state that was almost near death. I checked its body for any kind of wound, and I saw that it had a gunshot on its side. It was then that this creature, whatever it was, began to act very aggressive towards me, and almost coming back to life the closer I got to it. It started snapping at me and getting very lively all of a sudden. Maybe it was best that I step back into my boat, I thought, and so I did. And this thing started to become much more aggressive and hostile in nature, almost beginning to gain its strength back in a sort of second. That's when it started to try and stand up on 2 legs. Even though this thing was tiny, frail, and clearly hurt or injured, it didn't like that I was trying to help it. Even though I didn't care that this thing looked like a failed science experiment, it was in my inner best heart that I wanted to see this thing brought back to health, no matter how hideous it was or unnatural it was. Again, I've never seen a creature like this before, but the second it started acting aggressive and trying to attack me with as little strength as it had, that's when I realized I should get out of there, and so I did. As I'm kind of pulling away, this thing seemed to regain its strength so fast, and finally pursued me by jumping back in the water, swimming towards me. Listen, I know this sounds crazy and all, and normally I would tell you you're crazy if it did. This thing only seemed to pursue me for a little while after I got on my boat, and then disappeared underneath the water for good. I still think about it because this wasn't that long ago, and it was very weird. I've talked to some of my friends about it, and other people who are in my Animal Neighborhood Watch group, and nobody seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, or they think I'm making up the story. Anyway, believe me if you will, but this is my true sighting of something I would consider strange and unknown, and possibly paranormal. The only thing I don't quite understand is why it was so frail and weak and floating under the water, half on the shore, like it was yanked out of somewhere and thrown on its side, left to die, and then shot. Maybe it was stunned. Again, I don't really know. I'm just trying to get answers for all these questions that I have. Who really knows? Is it possible that this really was a science experiment and was pulled out here in the swamps and shot, left to die, because it was a failed creation? That is something that haunts me, still to this day. I'm posting this under a fake name and account, so it can't be traced. I know that probably sounds paranoid, but I just want to make sure. This needs to get out there so people can begin finding out about this creature that was so wrongfully made. It appears that you're well aware of Dogman and many of the other cryptids that exist. Well, about 4 years ago, I can tell you all more about the genetic experiments that began on hybrid creatures. These kinds of things have been going on for a very long time, so it's probably no surprise to you and people who are in that circle of knowledge. Things like this were fully field tested and were deemed to be ready, but something in the development stages went wrong. A specific breed of creatures that were part canine, part crocodilian. Some people on the team call them croc dogs, and I guess that is what they're called now. I don't know if there are many other sightings of these things, because they're relatively new development, but it is what it is. These creatures were designed to be super soldiers, to be used in upcoming and future wars. They were constructed and pulled from the DNA of Nile crocodiles and multiple species of canine, like German Shepherd, Retrievers, and Huskies. We thought that if we could make a chimera-like creature, along with the many others, it would have all the best abilities of both, the discipline of a canine, and would be a perfect companion and use an enemy for troops. They could have them breach and clear whole buildings of dangerous enemies. At first, the thought that it would have specific traits, scales and thick skin, and a canine's discipline and duty. During the testing stages, there were great results. In open combat simulations, they performed amazing. Their handlers were able to train them, just like they had trained any other disciplined animal. These were truly meant to be killing machines. But we did have to change some training scenarios. I don't know if you'd call them pups, but we'll refer to them as that, the younglings, of course. They would hunt down a target and subdue them. And our testing coordinator was bitten, and it didn't end well. The ferocity of these creatures was unmatched. They were extremely dangerous and hostile, one of which we actually had to pull down the power of their bite because it was too immensely powerful. Eventually, the project was discontinued when these things were getting older, and they became far too intelligent, possessing almost a human-like strategic intelligence, and began attacking their handlers. During other combat simulations, some of them were trying to help. Not all were a problem, but they became one. They had broken out and became too much to handle. Not long after things began to go south with the project, our coordinator was told by another unofficial branch of government who oversaw the entire project, was told to basically pull the plug. So many of our small branch of these creations were put down, so to speak. However, some made it out. I'm only writing this today because I found out one of them is in the wild, and I need to know that people need to be careful. I live in Georgia, just north of a testing facility that exists that many people probably don't know about, and I know a few of them are out roaming around. Again, these things aren't very old. They're just within the past few years. And I want you to know that these kind of chimera creations are existing all over the world. Some are getting out. Some are purposefully being let out. I feel incredible guilt over having a part to play in the design and creation and being a part of this project. Listen, I understand that sending this to you probably comes off as a creepypasta because there are so many that claim to have a story like I do, but are actually fictitious horror stories. Well, I'm here to tell you that this is my own horror story, and that these things are actually going on. So it's really up to you. You can believe it or not, but I'm telling you what I was a part of, and the creation that I helped make. I can't guarantee you how many of these things are actually out there. Just like Bigfoot or Dogman, there's an undisclosed number. But, just like their cryptid counterparts, they are highly intelligent, very hostile and aggressive, and masters of hiding and camouflage, especially in their swamp environment. Hello. My name isn't important, but for the sake of the story, I'll call myself Tiffany. I'm a 15-year-old from Dublin, Ireland. I know you are based halfway across the world, but thanks to the internet, I can reach out to you and tell you about an experience I recently had that spooked me beyond belief. Let me start by saying that I'm not your typical girly girl. I run, I hike, and I even play soccer occasionally with my brothers. I don't scare easily, is what I'm trying to say, so I know when I get scared. It's bad. And this was bad. Really horrendously bad. I was having a sleepover with two of my closest friends. We did what most teens do when we have a sleepover. We chatted about boys, painted each other's nails, messing around with TikTok, and even looked out my window and used our phones for bird watching. At least that's what me and my friends do. It was such a fun evening, and I spent most of it in belly fits of laughter. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such good friends in my life, and that these were the best days of our lives. My two friends then eventually got bored, so we racked our brains on things we could do. Because we were home alone, we decided to play hide and seek, for old time's sake. It had been years since we played it, and we thought it would be fun. Being 15, you're kind of in that awkward stage between partially a kid and partially an adult. It's hard for me to even type these events, as I can feel icy fear welling up within my body. Little did I know that this game would become the darkest, most frightening experience of my life. The other two girls decided to hide first, and I would count to 30 to allow them to find somewhere really secretive. I could hear them giggling away, just like we were 8 years old again, and I knew for sure somebody went up to the attic as I heard footsteps on the stairs. I hadn't been up there in years as it's super dusty, and I always end up sneezing. But I guess this meant I would have to go up now. I finally finished and left my bedroom, peering around the corridor to an empty hallway. I figured this would not be like hide and seek from our childhood days, but they would surely find somewhere truly elusive that would be hard for me to even access. I decided to check the attic first, as I was confident one of the girls had went up there. I figured it was Chloe, as the footsteps were quite loud, and Chloe is a sturdy girl, as opposed to Jojo, who is a wafer. I thread cautiously up the steps, trying to hold my breath in to avoid inhaling the musty odor. I could hear some whispers, as if both girls had gone up and hid. "Guys, I know you are up here. It's so gross," I said, trying to stop laughing. I just had an image of them hunched in the corner, amidst cobwebs and an old tattered furniture. I opened the attic door, and all of a sudden, I didn't hear a sound. It was eerily quiet, and the light switch was off. When I turned it on, it only illuminated a portion of the room, as it was so old. It was an old bulb, emitting only a few shards of yellowy, faded light. I noticed an old dresser in the corner, and I could have swore I saw something yellow behind the cracks in the cupboard. I knew that Jojo was wearing a yellow jumper, so I immediately knew it was her. I stood back though for a few seconds, and admired that she was brave enough to come up to the attic and find the cupboard in the dark room, and managed to not hurt herself. It almost seemed impossible, as I stood there imagining it. I also thought I would have heard her breathing or laughing, but the room was deathly quiet. As I reached out to open the handle, I had the oddest feeling I should turn, as if something was preventing me from opening it. I knocked away the crazy notion and flung the door open. At that moment, at least 10 bats flew out of the old dresser, out of the attic, and right into the hallway. I screamed at the top of my voice, falling to the ground and knocking my head against an old pram. That must have been mine when I was a child. I thought the other girls would have ran up to me, but I laid there for around 30 seconds, moaning as I had hurt my head and ankle. Before me, however, was a vision that made my blood run cold. My mouth must have opened to fit a football through it, and my eyes felt like they had been pried open. They were wide in horror and shock. A large spider, the size of a coffee table, stood before me. But the thing about this spider is, it had the face of a man. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry with dust and fear. This creature was black with 10 legs, what appeared to be antler-like appendages, and huge antennae raising out of its head. It also seemed to have large black wings that had tiny red spots all over them. I couldn't believe what was happening. Had I been knocked unconscious? Was I suffering from an hallucination? I continued staring at the creature, hoping it would not kill me, but expecting it to any second. How would my family find me? Bloodily mutilated in the attic, with no sign of anything? Or would the creature eat me and I would disappear without a trace? But still, the creature continued to stare, not indicating an overt aggression in behavior, but its posture spoke power and dominance over my now horizontal and injured body. I heard my friends running and shouting my name. Had they got worried? I could hear their footsteps climbing the attic door, and I turned to see them. At least if the creature killed me, I would see the faces of my friends as my last vision, and not the beast before me. When they arrived, I turned back, expecting the creature to pounce on all of us, but it was gone. There were no signs of it at all. I screamed in terror, telling them to run and to carry me. I knew the creature had to be somewhere, but one of the girls went back to check and found nothing. So too, my parents checked when they got back, and of course found nothing. I began to think I was crazy, that I had made it all up. Maybe I had some sort of paranormal experience. I don't know. But after reading stories on the internet, I now believe that I encountered some sort of large insectoid creature. It was hands down the most disturbing and unsettling experience of my life. The after effects have been equally horrendous, as I have had to drop out of school. My hair has fallen out due to stress, and sometimes I can barely eat. I am due to see a counselor next week who specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'm pretty sure they're going to think I have schizophrenia, especially once I tell them my encounter. You know, the whole ordeal just makes me want to scream. That's why I'm getting in touch, to see if you can help me and connect the dots with other people who have had any sort of similar experiences, whether it be in the woods or their own houses. Perhaps you can help me get through this. I strongly believe that the whole experience I had, whatever this thing was entirely paranormal. Hi. I had an experience when I was only 17 years old that I have never spoken about till now. I filed a police report about it at the time, but it was never dealt with, as the town I am from was so small, the cops didn't really do a thing. I believe I had some sort of sighting of something that I can't be too sure or explain. It was Halloween of 1995, and me and some of my friends went to shoot a documentary in our local woods. Listen, I know it sounds very Blair Witch, but it was actually a documentary about the role of trees for dispersing oxygen in the environment. I am an environmental scientist, and so I've always loved nature. But I guess what I saw on that trip showed me a different side of nature, a monstrous side to it, that perhaps it can spawn things so deadly and abhorrent to us humans that it makes us want to die. Because that's how I felt when I had this sighting, and anytime I think of it, I also feel a sense of dread and fear. I woke up at 3 a.m. one night. I was sharing a tent with one other girl. I got up to pee a little away from our camp, and I could see still the burnt embers where we had our toasted marshmallows just a few hours prior. I remember being a little appalled at how much litter we had created, but that was my conservationist instincts kicking in, even back then. After I had finished urinating, I stumbled back into camp. As I stood there, just on the margins of the camp, I could feel somebody's eyes on my back. It was the strangest thing. It was as if I could actually feel 2 laser beams burning my back. I turned around, feeling a little spooked, and squinted to see what looked like a large spider creature in the distance. I squinted again, and the figure seemed to take the shape of a man with large black wings. There was a purring sound from the creature, and its wings flapped open, wider and wider, revealing a myriad of dark colors amidst the black. I remember feeling awestruck and terrified. I was clearly encountering something supernatural. But then, my science instinct kicked in, and I thought maybe this was some kid from our school who we had heard were going camping and wanted to goof around with us. The creature, or whatever this was, alien being, demon, call it whatever you will, it continued to watch me, and I attempted to outstretch my hand to see what would happen. I know that sounds crazy, but I was immensely curious to get a closer look. At this gesture, the creature flew away, in a vertical line into the sky, leaving a trail of cobwebs and a purple-like aura after it. It was almost otherworldly. It was the weirdest thing, and I began to think I was having an hallucination, but I knew I wasn't. It was all too real. I could feel it in every pore of my body. When my friends woke me up the next morning, I told them about it, but they thought I was just messing around. I guess 25 years later, I wonder if I encountered some unknown species, half man, half insect. Perhaps some nocturnal, antisocial creature that was disturbed by me and my campers. Whatever it was, I haven't come across anything similar in all my nature excursions over the years. I hope you can help me find out what this creature could have possibly been. I've heard stories of the Mothman, but I don't exactly know if what I saw would count as that. Anyway, based on what I encountered, I felt the urge to write in. 2020 is the year, after all, of self-healing and discovery, and I know I have buried this memory for far too long over the last 25 years. Dear What Lurks Beneath, I am writing in from Malmö, Sweden, about a disturbing experience that occurred during the fall of 2017. I am a Swedish woman, 52 years old, and I have a grown-up daughter. My daughter is 28 now, and her father died young, well over 20 years ago, leaving me a young widow. Although this information might seem unimportant, it has caused me to acquire a strong self-belief and no-nonsense attitude. I do not watch TV or read the news, but rather spend my time volunteering at stables working with horses, or even doing freelance work as an interpreter. Life is good, but there has been something that has been on my mind for years, and is really weighing me down. I have always thought of myself as a gutsy lady, brave, unmoving, not disturbed by the usual female fears, spiders, bugs, etc. Instead, I will happily go for a walk at night alone, drive in the countryside alone, and even go on holiday alone. Solitude is central to my life, and I have grown accustomed to it. But lately, this solitude has become a prison, a breeding ground for my nightmares and feelings of terror and panic. I have now been frightened to leave the house. Instead, I peer at my village from behind my curtains. The road into Malmo is bustling with cars, but I can never go near the city. The panic is felt across every inch of my body. This level of panic and depression has been my existence for the last 3 years, and I should begin to tell you how it all began. It's not as if I was happy to begin with, but I've always been content with my lot. Every morning, for the last 20 years, I have taken a walk at our local woods at around 8 a.m. every morning. I had this morning ritual until the autumn of 2017. When my daughter was younger, I used to bring her, but the last 10 years or so, I have walked alone. The autumn of 2017 was particularly ravishing. I remember gazing at the plethora of yellows and oranges on the forest floor, and grabbing an armful of leaves and throwing them into the sky, watching them fall and dance around me. This was me at my happiest, at one with nature. The crunching of the leaves against my boots was also mesmeric, and I felt totally at peace and excited for the future. I can tell you, it was the 20th of October when I had a paranormal experience that confirmed my belief in other beings, sinister creatures. I was walking at a fast pace, and I had a light with me, as the pathway was dark. The sun was still coming up, and the sky was a medium blue hue. I have always loved how quiet it was on these mornings. It was always a perfect way to start the day. As I continued walking, I could hear a groaning sound from behind the trees to my left. I wasn't disturbed by this, but just assumed it was some kind of animal. As I continued walking, I also heard a whispering from the other side of the pathway. Loud whispers that sounded like men talking. I turned to my right and scanned in behind the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I always carried my peppermint spray, and I am trained in jiu-jitsu, so if any bad guys had any intentions, I was confident that I could take care of them. I was now fairly deep in the woods, and it was around 30 minutes back to the entrance, and 30 minutes to the exit. The sky was only getting brighter. I found it odd that I couldn't hear any birds singing. Usually, the forest was abuzz with all types of birdsong, and I would try and remember the rhythm and calls and research it after my walk in a book that I had at home. I loved interpreting the signs of nature too. I would arrive home and tell my daughter what the weather was going to be like next week, judged on the direction of how the wind was blowing or the color of the foliage. She would just roll her eyes and call me a tree hugger. And well, she was right. I never felt more like myself when I was walking in that forest, immersed in Mother Earth's glory. But this morning, there were no birds singing. The only sound was my feet against the wet leaves, and the swoosh of my rain jacket as I power walked deeper and deeper into the woods. I was going at a fast pace now, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my foot tripped, and I ended up face down on the wet forest floor. I also banged my head and rubbed it. My eyes felt a little off as I opened them, and I was dizzy. I really banged my head bad. My eyes were only seeing the floor, but with little white dots dancing around, as if I was under disco headlights. I had lived enough to know that this was a sign of a concussion. I scrambled my eggs down in my pockets and tried to retrieve my phone. Feeling it, I knew I had to ring the emergency services. There was no chance anyone else would be walking this early in the morning. The next thing I remember, I was feeling a bite at my leg. I screamed in agony and tried to kick whatever it was. Likely a fox, I thought. But no, it was something terrible. I was being carried from the pathway into the trees and foliage. I opened my eyes, but they were now only black. Something was clawing at my legs, too, causing me to wince in pain. I could also feel a pain in my lower stomach. It reminded me of the pains of childbirth. Had I been stabbed? The next thing that happened, I was thrown down in some kind of muddy puddle. I was too afraid to open my eyes, as I had no idea what had carried me in, and I knew I was in no fit state to fight back. As I opened my eyes, I realized I could see now. I scanned around, and my stomach seemed to fall into oblivion as I took in what I was seeing. Around me, there was a ring of tiny men with long noses, beards, pointy shoes, and even green hats. The men were around 2 to 3 feet tall and were watching me with an angry, solemn, indifferent expression. The only way I can describe them was that they were like goblin-like or elven-like, but to say that they were elves sounds too cuddly and cute. These creatures were hideous looking, absolutely diabolical. I began to wonder if I'd given myself a bad concussion and was now suffering hallucinations, but the imagery around me felt all too real, and the physicality of what I was feeling was also seeped into reality. This was happening, and I felt sick to my stomach. "Help," I remember muttering, but the words came out in pitiful gasps. I remember thinking about my daughter and how she would never know what happened to her mother. I was told I must not come here again, one of these things said, telepathically. It told me if I did, I would pay. I tried to answer to this thing, but the next thing that happened, I woke up in the car park of the forest. I looked at the reflection in the car and had scrapes and cuts all over my face. My hair was filled with twigs and debris, and as I looked down at my trousers, I realized I had peed myself. I raced into my car and drove home. Driving home, I was ranting and raving. I could have swore I saw one of those creatures in my back seat. I screamed maniacally and had to slam on the brakes as I was about to crash into the back of a lorry. And what had the goblins said about my husband? Andrew was 30 and died in a car accident all the way back in 2000. Had he been killed? My heart sank as I knew Andrew had the same ritual as me, but he went an hour earlier, at 7 in the morning. He had the same experience, but had been killed, clearly. It was too horrendous and unspeakable to think about. Telling my daughter about what had happened was nearly harder than the experience. She thought that I was crazy, that I had dementia, or that I was making it up for attention. It was the most heartbreaking thing to have her call me demented. I also tried to reach out to a few close friends, but they advised me to speak to my doctor and told me that stress and loneliness can cause people to see things that aren't there. I wasn't stressed or lonely, I told them. I saw something terrible, and I need you to believe me. Just one person to tell me that I'm not losing my mind. All I can say is that everyone thinks I'm crazy, and it makes me feel like hell. It's the loneliest feeling in the world, to be honest. But as I sit here, I know what I saw. Most days, I feel like a ghost, watching life happen from behind a glass mirror. I feel like I violated something in the forest, that I disturbed another world, and that world now had to kick me out. I've heard about fairies being possessive, but I've never thought about goblins, nor did I ever believe in such a ridiculous sentiment. I can't describe to you the fear and terror I feel on a daily basis. I live just a short drive from the forest, and I could see the tips of the trees from the top of my bathroom window. I know it's a means of self-torture, but sometimes I go up there and look out at the glimpse of the forest, imagining myself there again, violated and all alone. about to be sacrificed. I wonder, has anybody else had an experience like this? I'm just too afraid to reach out. My doctor has not been confidential, and now people around me think I'm crazy. It is a terribly lonely feeling that I live with every single day. I just hope that writing this experience in helps me. And not just me, but other people who can get in contact with you, and perhaps enlighten others about what they saw. Perhaps these are not vicious at all. Maybe it was my misinterpretation. But I just think of their cold eyes, watching me, treating me like a prey, a wretched thing on the forest floor. My daughter stopped speaking to me last year. She couldn't deal with my constant rants about what had happened. I dream about going back up there with a shotgun and shooting every last one of those fuckers. How dare they cause me to descend into madness, because that's what my life has now become. Sheer madness and misery. I have not washed my hair in 6 months. I look like a wreck. Neighbors turn away from me, and children are now frightened. I've become something else entirely. I don't know what's even happening to me anymore. I'm losing my mind. I used to be a huge lover of spelunking and caving altogether, but since this experience, neither me or my friend really have much of a taste left to go back. There are cavern systems all over the world, most notably in the Northwest, the Southeast, and even the Southwest. Specifically, New Mexico and Arizona have an amazing vast cavern system underneath that interconnects and intertwines for who knows how many miles. It's pretty crazy, and while that's all good and fun, part of the fun of caving is exploring new caves and new entrances that lead to different caving systems. That's the whole fun of it. So, you guessed it, me and my friend set out on an adventure to find new caverns to explore. We did this by exploring the vast New Mexico and Arizona desert, trying to find any entrances we could, or anywhere that we might suspect might lead to a new cavern system. Well, we found quite a few, but many of them weren't very deep, or if they interconnected, parts had been caved in on, which meant they were dead ends, so it didn't take us very far. That is, until we found one, which we spent all day looking, and didn't find anything, until we stumbled upon this system. I do believe that at some point, all tunnels and cave systems interconnect, but on this trip, we really didn't get the chance to test that theory out. We came across this entrance far in the wasteland of the desert. We were very confident that this entrance surely led to another caving system that intertwined with any close-by system around. Through many twists and turns, we kept going and going, until we got to a portion of the cave where we could start to hear a low rumbling noise. By the way, before I continue, if you end up reading this, anybody who gets to explore the caverns of the southwestern desert area, it's absolutely gorgeous. In fact, there are many tours you can take that lead you through tourist attractions all through these caves. Absolutely beautiful, and if you're into spelunking, I highly recommend you check it out. If you're a solo adventurer, it's also worth checking out. But again, after this, I think my friend and I have had our fill for a while, even in the COVID craziness. So, we're about 40 to 45 minutes deep in this cavern system, and at the time, we were in a very small chamber when we began to hear low rumbling noises, or at least that's what it sounded like. In that moment, I thought we might be underneath the road. It only made sense. But then as I listened more, and as the noise continued, the noise was coming from a chamber up ahead, and not directly above us. Something large in shape began moving towards us in our direction. That rumbling noise we were hearing now turned into a growling, guttural sound. We started booking it back towards the entrance, which was a long way, since, like I said, we were in there for probably about a good 40 minutes. Even though we couldn't exactly see what this was, something big was moving in our direction. You could hear it, and whatever it was, or whoever it was walking on 2 feet. Because of all the rocks, debris, and stalagmites, we couldn't really see what it was, but we could hear it was very heavy and moving very quickly in our direction. It must have heard us talking, or it must have heard us come through. Even though we had good lighting and good equipment, we couldn't really see it yet, until it came partially into view. Whatever this was appeared to be pitch black, and had these glowing white orbs for eyes. At least that's what we saw. It scared the living hell out of both of us. We thought that it was right there, that this is going to drag us down to the pits of hell, and we'd be gone forever. And I got goosebumps. In fact, I got them right now, just as I'm recalling this story to you, living in the moment of fear and panic. I can't even begin to describe to you the adrenaline rush that was pumping through both of our bodies. It was enough to move us quickly through and get back to the cave entrance. At some point, whatever it was chasing us had stopped. And if you know anything about caving, it isn't just as easy as running back to the entrance. There's a lot of sections and tunnels where we had to get on our hands and knees, or squeezing through tight spaces. Of course, it all depends on the cavern system you go into. Either way, whatever it was stopped following us at one point or another, and we couldn't hear it coming anymore. We eventually made it back to the entrance of the cave, and in that case, we quickly got out of there and fled. Me and this friend of mine have gone caving so many times before and have never encountered any living animals, other than maybe albino crickets or things like that. Spiders, bugs, and insects are common in caves, and it shouldn't be as a surprise. But animals, especially ones of significant size, are a rarity. It's not like we stumbled into the den of a bear. And besides, bears, to my knowledge, don't live in the desert. At least not the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. So what exactly is it that we stumbled into? What could be living that walks on 2 legs, that is totally pitch black, and gives off a terrible vibe, that lives in the New Mexico cave system? I'll try my best to really recount and give you the best description of what it is that I think we saw. Because we only got a partial view, it's hard to say. Like I told you, it was pitch black, so that I never really saw any hair or any definitive shapes. It was just large, upright, and walking. One thing I do remember, though, very distinctly, was it was breathing very heavily, kind of like a noise. It's hard to describe, really. Just try and think of a person who has smoked a pack of cigarettes every day of their life and was wheezing very heavily. Now take that and pitch drop it quite a bit. It was very deep, guttural, and not only was it growling, but it was accompanied by that horrible wheezing. Again, I don't think we really ran into a cave monster, because that just sounds too fictional for me, even though I'm the one that experienced it. But whatever it was, I just don't get the sense it was human. And then those white eyes, I have no idea what to even think about that. I kind of feel much safer now that me and him don't go caving anymore. Even though it was a huge passion of mine, I just can't get over the fear that we would run into something like this again. I mean, if that thing was living down in that cave, who knows what else we would run into? Maybe something worse. And I'm telling you now, I'm not willing to find that out. This isn't my story, but actually my good friend's, and it is quite remarkable. Well, he does a lot of solo camping, and in this case, which was about 15 years ago, got lost while exploring around in the Ozarks. Well, he came across a cavern, or what he describes was a cavern, to seek shelter in, and to hide from the elements, when he realized soon that he wasn't alone in the cavern. What he described to me, and I'll try my best to accurately relay this to you, is that he was chased out of this cavern by these large, hairy beasts that were upright walking, covered in hair, and walked just like men. There was about 3 of them, and they charged him out of the cavern from one of the lower levels of the cavern he was in. It about scared him to death, and he tells me that when he went in there, he didn't hear anything right away, But then that's when he could hear the ground around him shaking, and it getting more and more intense. And that's when he realized something, or these things, were running towards him through the large cavern opening. And that's when he told me that he turned his head right and saw these things approaching him, running at him at a very fast pace, causing him to run for his life and to jump up a tree to try and keep himself alive. Whatever these hairy things were, what he describes to me now and what he believes is that they were Bigfoot and that they were inhabiting this cave. I want you to keep in mind, at this time he was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from anything, out in the Ozarks. There wasn't a soul around, and he had no idea where the nearest trail even was. And because it was about 2005 or 2006, cell phones were still much more in their infancy, and so there wasn't really any service around that he could contact anybody for help. He ended up getting rescued about 4 days later, surviving off just what little rations he had left. That story, the portion I told you, is just a very small portion of his entire survival story out in the Ozarks. But that has nothing to do with what I told you about. I just thought I would tell you about the snippet, because that's what was really interesting. Maybe I can reach out to him and have him contact you, and that way he can tell you it from his perspective in full detail, exactly what he saw and what happened when he ran into that cave, because he tells it far more exciting than I can, and he's going to recall a lot more details. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Have a wonderful day, and stay safe. My parents died in a car accident when I was extremely young. I was probably only a year or so old. I was involved in it, in fact, but was luckily spared. I don't have any memory of it, or any memory of my parents. My only frame of reference for them is pictures. And it might sound bad, but none of them exactly rang a bell for me, or gave me the innate feeling of this is my family. So, while I did feel bad for them in the sense that their lives were taken so soon in such a violent manner, to me, they were just strangers, and I didn't particularly miss them. Still, sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like had they made it out okay, because it would have been entirely different. After the accident, I was taken care of by my grandfather, and I was raised with an unconventional lifestyle. He was divorced and estranged from my grandmother, and he didn't have any siblings. So, for most of my life, it was really just me and him, and whoever happened to pass through. That wasn't the odd part, though. My grandfather was a long-retired Navy veteran, but his love of the water stuck with him. I had spent most of my childhood alternating between staying in hotels and boats, and traveled down all sorts of waterways in the United States and Canada. Although my granddad was technically retired, he took on all sorts of jobs at ports just in order to maintain a source of income, and probably to keep his sanity too. He was an active man and hated staying in one place all the time, which is why nobody stuck with us in the long term. When I was 12, we were down in Oklahoma. It was the beginning of July, and although I was used to all sorts of weather conditions at this point, the heat and humidity that came down upon us was damn near unbearable. At first, I tried to sleep in a motel bed, but at that point, I'd grown so accustomed to sleeping in boats that I had trouble falling asleep unless I could feel water rocking the floor back and forth. It was like the opposite of seasickness. It was too still, too motionless. My grandfather got fed up with tossing and turning and allowed me to go back to the docks so I could sleep in the boat, figuring I was old enough to be left alone at this point. It was still uncomfortably hot and humid, but the rocking of the boat lulled me to sleep. I was a glorified baby who needed his cradle. However, after some time, I was awoken by the sound of a swishing in the water nearby. I assumed it had to be a fish, but the noises sounded far too heavy and forceful for that. I went outside and went to the side of the boat where most of the sounds were coming from. I checked over the railing, and through the dim light that the moon provided, I could make out the silhouette of what appeared to be a massive octopus sitting next to the boat, to the point where the top of its head actually poked out of the water. You can imagine my confusion in that very moment. Even if I wasn't raised on lakes and seas, any kid would know that octopi aren't freshwater creatures. There was no reason I should be seeing one in the wild in the middle of America. As soon as I leaned in to try and get a better look at it, it had swam away in the blink of an eye, the force of its movement rocking the boat a bit more some moments later. I wanted to go and tell my grandfather about my discovery, but I didn't want to wake him up. So I waited until he came back and got me the next morning. We went to dine at a small restaurant where I brought up what I had spotted. Before he even had a chance to say his piece, the people in the next table chimed in. The person who spoke up first was an older man. He said that the octopus, or that perhaps it was an entire species, plagued lakes and rivers across the state. He blamed it for the drowning of his black lab some years prior. My grandfather, skeptical, and before I knew it, a full-blown debate was occurring in the restaurant. Apparently, townsfolk here were pretty divided on whether or not this thing was real. I guess it was like another Bigfoot. Some people believe, and others don't. I was certain of what I saw, though, but my grandfather insisted that it was a dream. He said he'd seen far too many things on the water to believe something as silly as a massive freshwater octopus in the middle of the United States and nowhere else. In all fairness, the debate never got out of hand, for the most part. It just was a friendly banter and people placing bets. But it did definitely get noisy enough to the point where the owner had asked us to quiet down. Since it was the morning of the 4th of July, after we left, we found the entire town was pretty busy doing things like selling fireworks, food, decorations, and jewelry. We spent the rest of the morning exploring the shops and markets, and I didn't bother to try and bring up the octopus again. As afternoon came, we headed back out towards the lake, where people were out on their boats and swimming, and the sky was filled with the sounds of radios playing and people laughing. Nobody had even noticed a little boy struggling to keep his head above the water, but I did. I shouted that he was drowning and needed help. My grandfather dove in and swam after him, and once he got to him, I screamed as he was pulled down under as well. By now, more people around me noticed what was going on and ran over to help. A few moments later, my grandfather resurfaced with the boy. Once they finally caught their breath, the boy started to bawl. One man took the boy from my grandfather's arms, and they took him onto a boat, my grandfather climbing aboard along with them, as he was likely too exhausted to swim back to shore. I tried my best to see what was going on, but all I could hear was the boy crying about how somebody, or something, had kept trying to drag him under. At first, this warranted a search from a bunch of people to see if another child had drowned and grabbed onto the boy in hopes to save themselves. However, when nobody was to be found, it turned into a witch hunt to find the responsible party. They figured some other kid was trying to be a prankster and scare the boy, but took it too far. My grandfather made it ashore by now, and he did not seem to be in the mood to talk. In fact, he appeared to be entirely disconnected from the moment. I don't know what to say or do, so I just watched a few games of beanbags until the sunset, when I made s'mores with the other kids as the adults prepared the fireworks showing. The people who were pissed about the person who tried to drown the boy were almost all drunk by now, and the memory already seemed to be shoved in the back of their minds. I could tell something was still haunting my grandfather, though. When night fell, it came time to light up the fireworks. My grandfather and I sat back in our boat to watch. After the show, he finally decided to speak up. He said that when he rescued the boy, the force that pulled him under the water was so strong that he knew it could not have been a person, and that when he kicked the perpetrator so that I would let go of the boy, its body felt squishy and slimy, almost like jelly. Upon boarding the boat, after rescuing the boy, he swore he noticed the imprint of suction cups wrapped around the boy's ankle, but didn't say anything as he was in too much shock. My grandfather could be a very stubborn man, but for the most part, he knew when to admit that he was wrong. He said he changed his mind and believed me. Upon hearing his story, I was a little scared to sleep on the boat that night, but he decided to stay with me just to make me feel better. I swore that I still heard the swishing and can feel sporadic hard waves hitting the boat, but I didn't dare move or say anything, as I hoped to trick the thing into thinking nobody was there. The night proceeded without incident, and by morning, we were back eating in the restaurant. People had regained interest in the near drowning that had happened the day before, and my grandfather told his piece. Some were still skeptical, but most seemed to believe him. I suppose my granddad just had a way with words. Those who were skeptical, however, did not display the same friendly banter they had the day before. They said that a kid nearly lost his life, and just because my grandfather saved him didn't mean it was okay for him to make up fairy tales and to try and romanticize or embellish the incident. My grandfather said he would never do such a thing, and soon enough, an argument had broken out between those who believed my grandfather and those who did not. The restaurant owners ultimately kicked us out for causing a ruckus, and upon exiting the building, a few of the folks around us told us that we had outstayed our welcome and needed to leave, having some food thrown at us in the process even. My grandfather and I knew it was pointless to try and make them believe us anymore, so we were back in the boat within minutes. From there, we left and never returned. My grandfather and I continued to sail together for 11 more years until he passed away from a stroke. There are plenty of interesting stories from that decade, but none of them came close to being as bizarre as the one I just told you. I decided to settle down from the sailor life, as it was simply not the same without him, and it took me a while to adjust to living on land, especially in only one place, but I managed to make it work. Like my granddad, I still had a love for the water and a general yearning to go back, but I feel as if I will be disappointed if I do. Regardless, despite my desires, I still find myself itching with curiosity when it comes to that creature. I wanted to see if it was still lurking in the waters, and I doubted anybody would recognize me if I returned to that lake, considering I have been an adult for quite some time now. Another part of me knows I should probably just let it be, because should I happen to come across it again, I would never be able to sleep that night without my grandfather beside me. My first memory formed when Hurricane Katrina had happened. I was 4 years old, and my family was urgently packing their things as needed to flee our home in New Orleans. We ended up driving off to my grandparents' house in a more rural part of the state. I recall looking at the TV a couple of days later and seeing live footage of the Six Flags amusement park being absolutely flooded with water, to such a severe degree that only its tallest points stuck out from the blue void that encapsulated it. I thought that instance in my life was where my fear of natural bodies of water developed. I was fine with swimming pools. In fact, I have many fond memories of going to pool parties and water parks as a kid, but that was because the water was chlorinated and clear. In most natural bodies of water, you can't see anything below a few feet at best, and even then, it was much murkier than man-made pools. You could have offered me $1 million, and I would still refuse to go further than knee-deep in a lake or ocean. To say it made my family vacations a bit difficult would be an understatement. Anyway, my grandpa passed away some years ago, and a few months back, my grandma did as well, leaving their house vacant with a whole bunch of stuff to sort through. Both of my parents were working, and because it was June at the time, I was freshly out of school. This left me as the only person in my family who had the time to drive up to my grandparents' house and determine what to keep, what to sell, what to throw away, and so forth. It would be my first time visiting the house since Katrina, so a solid 15 years. My family simply never made the time to go back after we'd found a new place to live in. We didn't even reside in Louisiana anymore. I pulled up to the house at around noon and got around to sorting as assigned. There really wasn't anything special. It was mostly just junk. As night fell, I decided to take a break, watch some YouTube, and eat some snacks. After I started a video, I heard a bizarre gargling come from outside. I don't know why at the moment, but my heart began to race. I paused the video, and a few moments later, it happened again. I was in full-on fight or flight mode now, but also incredibly confused. I looked out the sliding glass door that led to the back balcony to see what it was. I didn't find anything, but my eyes laying upon the swamp before me triggered a series of memories I had completely blocked out of my brain before then. After child me watched the Hurricane Katrina footage that night, I was about to sleep in the bedroom with the balcony when I heard that same gargling coming from the swamp. I went to look at it, and there, standing waist high in the water, was a creature I could best describe as skeleton-shaped, covered in moss, lily pads, and twigs. It was lanky, and it appeared to have no eyes. I suppose the strangest part is that I don't remember feeling scared upon seeing it. I was more intrigued than anything else. However, before I could do anything, my grandpa caught me standing there and told me to go back to sleep. But the same thing happened the next night, except this time, I spotted with the water up to its shoulders. I was intensely curious, so I went onto the balcony and down the stairs that led to the backyard. Even though this thing lacked eyes, only sockets where they would have sat, it still seemed to stare at me, and its gargling ceased. I said hello to it, and in response, it slowly submerged itself back in the water. Then, some seconds later, reappeared and slowly stood up, to the point where the water was only up to its knees. It began gargling again as water dripped off its body, and it slowly extended its bony hand to me, tilting its head. I figured it was friendly, and stepped forward while reaching my hand out, touching one of its hard, slimy fingers. For a moment, it didn't do anything, then wrapped its hand around my wrist, gently tugging at it, encouraging me to come into the water. I told it no and pulled back. It didn't like this. Its grip grew stronger, and it snapped its head back into an upright position. Its gargling turned into hissing, and the shrubbery on its hands seemed to tie itself around my wrist as well. But at that point, who knew what was really happening? Before I knew it, I was being dragged into the murky depths. I screamed as loud as I could, but was silenced when I was forced face down into the water. I could not see anything, and my lungs quickly filled with distilled mud as I thrashed around to the best of my ability in hopes to escape. My father pulled me out, and I coughed up the water and began crying. He tried to calm me down, but there was no point. I remember screaming to him about this skeleton creature, but he just seemed confused. If I were in his shoes, I would have just assumed I had a nightmare and sleepwalked into the swamp. Once I finally began to relax, I was brought inside, given a bath and a change of clothes, and something to eat. I ended up spending the rest of the night in a sleeping bag on the floor of my parents' room. I have some flimsy memories here and there of being put on a child's leash for a couple of years, but I never considered that this event was probably what made my parents decide to do such a thing. No doubt in my mind that the event is what truly triggered my fear of natural bodies of water as well. I was pulled out of my recollection of thoughts to the sound of gargling again. I knew there wasn't much I could do. I refused to sleep outside, and I didn't even want to look out the window. I didn't want it to catch a glimpse of me. I had brought my AirPods, so I continued to watch YouTube and Netflix until I fell asleep. I'm surprised I achieved such a feat. My nightmares that night were awful. I dreamed that this skeleton stood outside my window, watching me sleep, and that my bedroom began filling with swamp water until there was only a few inches between me and the ceiling. And when I woke up to the sun coming in through the curtains, I had never been more grateful. I knew I didn't want to stick around this place much longer, but at the same time, there was a lot of work to be done. I wasn't a foolish child anymore. I just needed to stay in the house. Even then, if it did come into contact with the thing, chances were I would be able to fight back by now. It probably only seemed ridiculously strong as a child because I was only 4 years old. The dumb part of me wanted to go out of my way to antagonize this thing, to seek my revenge, but I ultimately knew better than to do that. It would be best if I kept my distance. I continued sorting through my grandparents' junk, the daytime being slow-paced and uneventful, which I was grateful for. However, soon enough, I had stumbled upon something peculiar, and that was my grandmother's paintings. They were normal at first. During her lifetime, she depicted a lot of natural, realistic scenes of forestry and mountains. But then, I found the paintings of the swamp. As I just mentioned, they were completely ordinary when I began to sort through them. But then there were more. As I went through the paintings, I began to spot the creature in them. With every painting, its body ascended further up from the water, and it only got closer to the foreground. A shiver went up my spine. It felt like I shouldn't be seeing this stuff, and I didn't want to touch it anymore. I shoved the paintings back into a corner and knew I had had enough. It was sunset by now, and I wanted to be out before dark so I wouldn't hear the awful gurgling of the thing. As soon as I made my way to my car, the familiar noise made its way into my ears. I could not help but look back. There, in the distance, I could make out the creature in the water, with nothing but its neck and head above the murk. Upon me spotting it, it slowly descended back down until it was no longer visible. I wasn't going to mess around anymore. I got in my car and I drove the hell out of there, not daring to look back. On my way home, I called up my parents and told them about what had happened and the memory I had resurfaced. My parents were surprised to learn that I had no memory of nearly drowning, as apparently it impacted me for a long time, that I was constantly anxious and wandering around, anticipating the skeleton to return. They claimed that my behavior persisted until a little after I started first grade, and once it subsided, they took that as a cue to let me off the leash. There haven't been any problems since then. I mean, until now, I suppose. My parents, while not super religious or spiritual, let me know that they thought it was best that nothing from the house was brought back into ours. So, I ended up pulling over on the side of a country road, littering my grandparents' belongings onto a field. I hoped that nothing would happen to anybody who decided to pick them up. And even though it had been a couple of months, I still worry about it. I returned home and nothing happened. My family and I don't really talk about it. I hear now that Hurricane Laura is going to hit the entire state of Louisiana. And although it is a horrific disaster, I unapologetically hope that it decimates my grandparents' house and the land along with it. I do not know whether or not that thing is living, or a ghost, paranormal, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It didn't even matter that I was hours away from it at this point. I wanted it gone, as any sane person would. You know, it still perplexes me how my grandparents appear to live peacefully for years with that thing, whatever it was. Maybe they had no clue it was real, and my grandmother saw it in her dreams like I did, and inserted it into her paintings because of that. Regardless, speculating on it is useless because they're dead now, and it is impossible to ask. In case you're wondering, I still do have my strict standards when it comes to navigating natural bodies of water. If anything, this entire event has reinforced my fear. Take my advice if you will. Don't go treading in murky water. You never know what can be waiting for you in there.